All right, welcome everybody. Appreciate you joining. So my name is Steve Karam. I am the Director of Customer Education and Experience at Delphix. We're going to be talking today about a title that's longer than my title. We're going to talk about ensuring compliance with data privacy directives using virtual databases. So there was a good, lively discussion prior to us getting started. A lot of those points will be touched on. So if we can go through what the agenda includes. First, we're going to talk about ensuring compliance to disparate data privacy directives. The disparate word, what does that really mean here? We're going to get into this, but the idea is that there is no just government. There are multiple departments, multiple agencies, multiple places that you might need to share data. There is also multiple regulation that each individual department may be beholden to. And we're going to go through how to comply with that. 2 and 3 at once. 2, develop catalogs of custom data sets for targeted distribution. I mentioned before we got started, there's a lot of preconception about how data gets shared. If you are a developer, a SQL developer or something like that, or an IT manager or whatever else, you may be used to the concepts of replication and data feeds. I'm hoping to talk about a different way to share data. That is a very compelling way, but can also be made incredibly secure. And we're going to go through that. And then third, we're going to talk about scaling an auditable process while reducing operational burden. If I want to distill that down, what I'm really talking about is self-service for end users, but self-service that does not sacrifice security of your constituent data. All right? And that is where we are going to get started. Before we do start, I would like to say, I have to add in something we were talking about. I would like to welcome California Department of Social Services to, as a Delphix customer. I don't know if anyone in the room is with them, but we, oh, very good. There we go. Thank you. So let's go ahead and get started. We all know, and we've all been talking about the importance of data sharing. There's been some fantastic presentations already. And I love seeing these things on how we're going to use data, how we are going to analyze it, how we are going to, new development efforts around data. But the one thing that I see always ends up forgotten is how are we going to actually gain access to it? How are we going to develop against databases that belong to one department, but we need them for contractor work or for work that is being done through another department? How can we facilitate the sharing of data when databases are incredibly huge? They're incredibly difficult to make, to replicate or make copies of. How can we solve all of these problems? And we're going to go through those things in just a moment. But we know that sharing data is critical for creating new programs, for improving existing programs. We know that if we want to be able to develop against citizen data, we need a way to get access to it that meets whatever regulations for the field that we're developing against. We know that we need to have a way to rapidly get access to quality data. And that's what we'll be talking about. Some of the benefits: better and more usable services, more efficient use of resources, better decision making, and improved well-being. I'm not going to go too much into the benefits of data sharing. That's what we're all here to talk about to begin with, is why we want to do it. One example, I'm pulling up this example because it's something that I have a background in. As Director of Education at Delphix, I do come from something of an education background. Anyone else here involved in education, department of, or anything else? Okay. No principals of a grade school or anything like that. All right. So one of the interesting things with education, you've got so many uses for that data that folks don't really think of. Anything from alumni outreach, e.g. collecting more money for the school from folks that have been there before. You have so much information about every student that has passed through your school or university. Student data, attendance data, progress through testing, questioning, quizzes, homework assignments, projects, any kind of grants they may have applied for, scholarships. there is a wealth of information about every person who has passed through your state's education, whether it's high school or college or whatever else. The uses for things like academic performance, yearly progress, graduation rates, but even more so, demographic data based off of education information can be incredibly useful for companies that are looking to hire the best and brightest, for example, in the future. I'll go into one of those in a moment. But then on the other side of that, if we want to actually develop against and use that data, we have a number of data privacy laws that are going to hold us back, so to speak. We've got the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, FERPA, which basically puts a limit on the amount of private information about a student that you can even share with any software. So for example, if a higher education, if test scores are stored inside of a database, or the progress of a student through college is stored, you are not allowed to actually use that student's actual given name. You are not allowed to use any identifying information about that student in the development of analytics that will be presented back to the public. Even if you don't give that information out, you just use it in your data crunching, you are not allowed to use that student's real name in your data crunching. You have to come out with ways to cleanse the data beforehand. Very difficult regulations. I know you guys have got your own challenges in this regard. Some form of, even a byline of a regulation can make it very difficult to work with the data you have. Getting access to it is hard enough, but then working with that data against whatever your own personal regulations are is very difficult. You're from Energy, and you, sir, you are from? DMV. Okay, so I'm sure that both of you have different regulations that you have to adhere to. Maybe some of the same that govern the entire state. For example, California Public Records Act. But then I'm sure that you also have separate regulations against each of your modes of collecting data. What gets really interesting is finding the balance when 54% of adults, a poll done by Citrix, 54% of adults said the public sector keeps their personal information more secure. There is a wide belief that the public sector is more secure than the private sector. That makes sense. You go to the DMV and you have to present 50 forms of ID. You go to Facebook and you get to tell them everything about your life and they can use it in any way they want. So there is this belief that the data is being used very safely, very securely, but 41% of respondents in a KPMG poll says that the public sector is too cautious. Now, what does that mean? Why would they say the public sector is too cautious? They want government to have the same ease of use and the same convenience that they get out of the private sector. That is the poll that KPMG did. They want access to digital services from the government that make things just as easy as it is to sign up for a Facebook or buy something new on Amazon, right? And that is a difficult program to create when you have the burden of not being able to share your data quickly or easily with outside contractors, with other departments or whatever else. And when even that you can, if you were to share important data with a different department, how do you regulate, how do you manage the data and the private information in that data? For environment, I'm not sure as much. I'm sorry, I'm not as accustomed to the data that you might store. DMV, I'm very much accustomed. Anyone with a license is. There's a lot of private information there. And any data you share, I'm sure, has to be incredibly secured.
How you go to Facebook?
You don't have to answer that.
You probably go to Facebook and get all the information.
So KPMG, one of the reasons I find that one interesting, I'd been working for a project in my education days for KPMG. You know, the big four accounting firms, they are very much instrumental in bringing on people out of college and helping them get their CPAs so that they can provide a valuable service to that company. Now, if someone joins one of those accounting firms and they are not ready for their CPA, let's say they just didn't do well enough, they didn't study well enough, they're not ready, they're benched. They don't get their CPA and basically they're kind of useless to the company that brought them on. The problem with that is that that reduces the ROI of any new people that are brought into these big four accounting firms. So we had been looking at a system, a software, that would analyze, and this was years before the big, the data explosion of data analysis. This was in the older BI days, cubes and slicing and dicing. I kind of miss those days sometimes. They were easier. No, don't miss those. So what we were looking at is, okay, we have access to test scores. We know how Bob did on his accounting tests. So we can help them by creating a system that will give them information about which students are more likely to be able to pass the CPA test as soon as they join. That'll be fantastic. Not so fast. FERPA did not allow us to do that. We weren't allowed to develop such an application because it contains information about Bob. It contains information about where he grew up. It contains information about which building he did a certain test in. All of those things based on FERPA were considered ways that you could identify this student whose rights were protected by that regulation. So we had to come up with a way to use demographic information instead. This is the type of student that will probably get their CPA very quickly. But then we have to cleanse the data. And again, I have a background as a database administrator developing against databases. I know all about how to cleanse data, but it is not that easy to know what to cleanse, how to do it, how to get this done in line with all of the other things. And then how are we going to even develop against this when our development team is offshore? 100 other problems that we didn't know how to deal with. Because the data is it's a huge beast. There's so much valuable information as we're learning from all of these sessions. And I think there's one coming up after this. There's a great session that's going to be a master leveraging data session. But it's no good if you can't get the data where it needs to be, to the right people, at the right time, and you can't keep and ensure that the data is protected based on whatever regulation you need to adhere to. So the challenges, again, we've kind of been going through these. I ramble sometimes. We've been going through these as we go along. Meeting strict data privacy laws, and they can be very strict. Collecting and synchronizing data across disparate systems. Each of you comes from one or more departments, or comes from a different department within the state of California, or maybe a contracting organization or whatever else. You each have multiple databases. Some of them, you have unstructured files. You have unstructured data living in new kinds of databases. You may have old school SQL Server or Oracle databases. I say old school, but they're still modern. We all still use them. So how are we going to collect all of that data? How can we synchronize across our different applications and our different systems when we're looking at sharing data? Accessing data in a timely manner to meet directives. I'm not going to go around and ask everyone how large their databases are. One university that I worked with had an 8 terabyte student database. 8 terabytes to store 5 years worth of student information. That seems like a lot, but it's also nowadays seems like so little. It took about 2 weeks for us to create a clone of that database to provide to a QA or development organization. 2 weeks to refresh that database, right? Using the old-fashioned methods and all of that. Making decisions using low-quality data. This is another big one, is low-quality data is very real. When we talk about data sharing, again, everyone's got in their head what data sharing is. A lot of people focus on things like replication, all right, or data feeds where maybe you dump an XML feed once a week and you send that out to a group of channels and they load that data up into their database. Whatever that story may be, unless it is consistent to a point in time, unless it is consistent with your other applications and databases, and unless it is a whole picture, a whole database, you can't make decisions on it. It would be like for the DMV, for example, making decisions on which direction to take your policies in the next year, or which direction to take on a new method of reporting for tax purposes or whatever else, based on a 10% subset of your users, of the people who visit the DMV. Low quality data is also a huge concern. Managing troves of personal information, we've been going on about that. Providing easy, transparent data access. Again, being able to make data available to others in a consistent way that can be accessed among different groups, different departments, different contractors. Last big note, who owns the data? How do you keep citizen data safe? This is to a point that was discussed prior to the beginning of this conversation. How do you keep data safe and build confidence? How do you broker the flow of information between agencies and departments? And how do you promote information sharing to enable digital transformations in a transparent manner? All comes down to who owns your data. Which department, if you are part of the DMV or you're part of the Department of Education and you are sharing data with other departments, who actually owns the data that's being shared? If you're sending out a feed of data, you don't know who has access to it, who has copies of your users' most critical information. So I just wanted to basically bring in exactly what we're trying to solve here. What we're going to talk about is what a modern data platform looks like. And I say data platform because, again, there's databases, there's file systems, there's unstructured data. Too often, and I'm sure you may have even seen it as we're talking now, data sharing, the idea of sharing data sounds really nebulous. But what it all comes down to is we need a data platform to manage the variety of databases and locations where our data is stored. So a modern data platform enables data to be delivered to stakeholders with speed, simplicity, and security to meet dev, test, and analytics demands. What this means is that if you are trying to, how many of you are coming directly from a department within the government or an agency within the state government? All right, all of you then. Okay, so no contracting organizations here. Using contracting organizations perhaps for development. I don't know about that. But to actually do all the things we need to do, a modern data platform needs to be able to give us speed, simplicity, and security. We need to be able to instantly move data. We need to have automated and orchestrated processes. We need self-service capabilities so that our end users can actually push a button to get the latest data from a production system or a source environment. We need secure and governed data. We need to make sure that whoever owns the data to begin with, whoever owns a database full of constituent information, remains the owner, sets the rules on who's allowed to see what. That is the idea behind governing our data. So what Delphix does, Delphix allows us to connect and synchronize data across departments and systems by building that data platform. At its core, what Delphix is, well, we can actually basically say what Delphix is: a software appliance, okay? So Delphix is a software appliance that is able to ingest data from a multitude of databases, file systems, and from that, we are able to store changes to that data over time and then provision out virtual replicas of that data over time. It goes beyond that. We'll get into that in just a moment. But if we have, for example, student data, DMV databases, court data, from any of your databases, any of your applications, can be ingested into the Delphix data platform. From there, once data is collected across government agencies, in that central location, we are able to not replicate, not stream data or send out feeds, but to provision exact duplicates of your actual databases in their entirety. And we can do this in minutes, no matter what the size of your source data. So whether you have an 8 terabyte Oracle database or 20 terabytes of file system data about your users or whatever data collection you have, we are able to store that and then provision copies of that data in minutes. That's one capability, and that's a capability that might scare you at first, like, well, I don't need more copies of my data being out there, right? But the first step, again, is to be able to provide access to your databases outside of your own organization, right? So, collecting data, storing it in a synchronized, centralized location, and then being able to provision that data quickly and efficiently. We can also do this across time. What I mean by that is a lot of times with these analytics tools that we keep talking about and how to leverage our data for analytics, the idea of what does our data look like today versus what did it look like last week versus a year ago. One of Delphix's core capabilities, by provisioning out clones of data, you are also able to provision out data as it was during a certain point in time. provision a clone of a database as it was today, as it was a week ago, as it was a year ago. All right, Delphix provides us the ability to synchronize and then provision those clones, as we call them, VDBs, virtual databases. But where it gets really good for meeting our regulatory requirements is another part of this data platform, which is inline data masking. Inline data masking is what makes it possible to actually use this for government purposes. As we bring data into our Delphix platform, we are able to use inline and orchestrated data masking against our data sets so that as we provision these clones of databases, our sensitive data can be masked depending on the type of data that we are sending out and depending on who we are sending it to. And this is what I meant in the original topic for this part of the agenda, creating for disparate data regulations. The idea here is that if we can clone our productions or source databases, if I can create copies of those for other departments or agencies to use in just minutes, and if I am able to mask that data so that it meets their regulatory requirements, this will allow us to provide access to important agency data faster and more securely than any other solution out there. Oops. So with embedded native masking, we are able to distribute to other departments, other agencies, third parties, or even cloud. That's another one of the key areas where there's regulation within organizations on where you're allowed to send your data. But with data masking, again, being able to take our data and change it into meaningful but obfuscated information. So again, we start with, you've got a source database, very large. You provision a virtual clone of that database in just minutes. But before it is accessible by end users or other agencies, if we can change social security numbers, phone numbers, names, to have meaningful but obfuscated information, we can ensure that we can provide access to quality data without giving up key sensitive information, depending on the agency that you're sharing with. So for example, George may become Ramonth, Mary may become Clara, John may become Damien. And even better, being that we have different applications within our organizations, we have maybe one that has data in a SQL Server database, some of you may use MarkLogic, some of you may use, which stores in XML, some of you may use Oracle. If we can ensure that the name changing and the social security numbers, if this data is repeatable across all of your different platforms. So if John becomes Damien in Oracle, John also becomes Damien in your SQL Server repositories, in your ERP systems, wherever your data may be. The masking goes across all of those. So we maintain referential integrity across all of your systems. So for this section, the modern data platform, and the reason it's important to introduce this is that the modern data platform allows, in our view, two things. One is the ability to rapidly provision clones of your data, to be able to provide instant access to clones of your databases for QA, for testing, for development, and then to be able to ensure that that data is kept safe and secure at rest, not encryption. Encryption is very important for making sure that as data is going along the wire, that it is protected and secure. But it's also very important to make sure that the actual data in our tables, social security numbers or student names or whatever else, is kept secure along the way as well.